Listen.
Okay, here we go. Dumbest thing I could probably say. Endings are so important in movies. I kind of look at it in the same sense as football. If you fumble the ball in the opening drive or even in the first quarter, yeah, it could hurt you and it can cause problems, but you can also recover from that and probably right the ship. However, if you fumble the ball in the last quarter or in the last possession of the game, the chances of coming back from that are slim, and the game can easily be lost. And that's how important a good ending in a film is. Now, I would probably stop short of saying the ending in this movie is bad. It's not bad, but it does sort of fall apart in a way that is disappointing given the rest of the film. Arcadian is a 2024 movie about a man trying to raise two twins at a remote farm after monsters or aliens have taken over the world. Now, this movie basically, for lack of a better description, is a low-budget version of A Quiet Place. The movie itself centers on a family roughly 15 or 16 years after some kind of global apocalyptic event, leaving everyone inside this dystopian world, sending everyone back like 100 years technologically. Now, Nicolas Cage plays Paul, the father of two twin boys, Joseph and Thomas, played by Jaden Martell and Maxwell Jenkins. And they live on a small farm in the middle of nowhere and have a very simple life. Now, simple being they don't leave the farm at night and have to lock everything up super tight because that's when the monsters come out. Now, we don't really know much about these monsters or where they come from, and that's kind of fine by me. Like, the backstory is irrelevant if the present story isn't really built on how or why they came. Like, this is the reality they live in, so it's the reality that we're experiencing. There's even a little wink at the camera later on when Thomas and the girl next door that he likes, Charlotte, try to guess how the apocalypse happened, 15 or 16 years ago before their time. So we're set up with this world and premise. It's super dangerous at night to the point where you can't step outside at all. Also, we learn very early on through Joseph that these monsters seem to have some kind of intelligence as their tactics have been changing. So far, all good here. The first thing that stood out to me in this movie was the acting. Now, there is great acting here, both from the two boys and from Cage himself, who plays a more grounded Nicolas Cage performance than he has played recently. Now, sometimes he gets his perception, and some of that is earned, that every movie he's in, he's playing a wacky character. And although that can be true, you don't have to go much further back than his recent movie Longlegs, but he's still a really good actor, and he can play a more realistic character when he wants to, and does it really well. He's by no means a one-trick pony. The interaction here between the family is nuanced and feels real and grounded in fear, and just trying to keep people safe. Second thing here is I found myself really grabbing onto this story. I really liked it. I like the world that we're dropped into, and I know this story has been kind of done before, and certainly recently. Like, I think of something like It Comes at Night, Light of My Life, or A Quiet Place. All have very similar elements, but this holds its own in a world building and character department. Well, for at least the first 2/3 of the film, but then it kind of starts to take on water. Okay, before I go any further, I have to talk about the shaky elephant in the room. Some of the camera work in this movie is atrocious. Now, as a general rule, I hate shaky cam, but handheld camera work can be a nice tool in certain situations. When this movie started out, I saw it was going to be handheld on the verge of shaky cam, and I got worried. But it did just sort of feel like it was more of a verite style, and it actually fit the setting of a dystopian future. This sort of kind of fighting for your life, trying to survive element. And I was fine with it for the first half of the film because it did have a grittier presence about it. Until the action part started. Oh boy. Did that jump into shaky cam territory right quick. Alright, here's the thing. I understand moving the camera fast during action sequences to symbolize the fast-paced action. The character's overwhelmed, so it's trying to put the audience in their shoes. But the line for me is, can I understand what is going on? If I can understand, then I'm more likely to excuse the shaky cam. With this movie, it had two things going against it. One, it was shaky cam with super fast editing, and 2, it had really dark scenes. So there was more than a few times I literally did not know what the fuck was happening on screen. And I'm sorry, that is just inexcusable to me. It's like I'm into the movie and the setting and the tension, and then all of a sudden I'm squinting at the screen just saying, is that an arm, an eye, a monster? I have no idea what's going on right now. I mean, there was one point where it seemed like Thomas was being attacked underground by a monster. And then Nicolas Cage kind of shows up saving him, and then in the next cut, he was still above him looking for him. I mean, I've watched it twice and I still don't understand the sequence because it was so dark and quick cut that I just couldn't put it together. It drove me bananas throughout this entire film. As soon as the action started, it was just a big guessing game. Now, I'm sure that type of camera style was a creative choice, and probably one of the reasons for that is to obscure the monsters as best as possible, which I will say the creature design was pretty unique. I'll give it that. But it was also really hard to get a good sense of what it was for most of the movie. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as what you don't see is always scarier, and I understand that because it's a lower budget film, so less is always more. But eventually it does show it in a full view, and the design falls into the dreaded too much CGI trap. Now, CGI can be a great tool, and I'm not saying every monster needs to be practical. There are challenges with practical monsters that can go beyond some productions. Also, CGI can move in a way that sometimes puppets and people can't. However, I still maintain that if you stretch CGI too far, it just loses its teeth. And this definitely does that. It makes monsters with such odd movements that it doesn't really sell the stakes that are needed. Also, this falls victim to the power level problem for monsters that always kind of bothers me, where you start a movie with a certain fear factor, but that fear factor goes down through the movie as opposed to up. Now, these villains are fabled to be so incredibly dangerous, nobody can be out at night. You have to lock up every single night, super tight. But then as the movie goes on, people seem to be able to move around at night without too big of a problem. And the creatures themselves are killed several times without too much trouble. That scene I mentioned earlier where Thomas gets saved by Paul just kind of kills it on its own without too much hassle. And that makes these creatures less scary. Also, in the beginning, it suggested that these creatures are smart and that they use tactics to figure things out. So they don't appear to just be mindless monsters. And that's great. But then the end just kind of turns them into mindless monsters. That's not so great. So that's what I mean when I say the fear factor should be going up, but instead it's going down. Like the boy gets trapped outside, but then kills one. Going down. They trap and kill another monster. Down further. They seem to be able to be killed with a baseball bat. Down, down, down. By the end, they are literally just a horde of random monsters, and that loses the individuality and deadliness of them. You look at something like Aliens, which might be the greatest positive example of doing faceless monsters. The fear level of those creatures never wane. Here are a group of Marines with the best tech possible, and they can only kill a few, and they're always retreating. The people are always dying. Nobody seems to kill an alien with a baseball bat or a knife. So I'm not going to really get into a whole spoiler territory here, but I will say the ending itself does sort of encompass all of these kind of problematic characteristics, and why I felt the last act fumbled the ball a little bit for me. It went from creatures that were super deadly and smart to just another horde of CGI monsters that they seemingly can escape from whenever they're in a tight situation. Now, the end isn't bad per se, but it is a little bit of a letdown given the first half, and that, with the combination of the shaky cam, just kind of makes it feel a little cheaper than it really deserved to be. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this movie is a positive thing, and that is the production design. The production design in this is fantastic, and the feel and atmosphere of this world is great. By and large, I really liked the adherence to almost practical or natural light. It got dark at times, which was mostly fine until the action sequences. Now, if it had action sequences where I could at least understand what was happening, I probably would have been fine with that as well. It's a bit sad, really, because For most of the movie, I was really enthralled, and the human elements here are very well done and interesting. I mean, I was inside of the B plus world for a good portion of this film, but the drop in power level of the creatures and the ending just kind of moves in a way that really hurt it and knocked it down to what I would call a B minus. But let me know what you think.